Okay, hi everyone. This is the rest of the chapter 4 lecture, which is on the effects of stress on health. Just a few things that I wanted to just clarify that I realized that maybe I might have been confusing in class. So this figure, the whole beginning of class, we're kind of talking about perceptions of stress and sort of general effects, and that they have immune suppressing effects and things like that. And then we talked about coping mechanisms. The next part of the chapter is a little more technical and really is going to, sort of, again, reiterate the two pathways that are going to be activated. So here I want to, again, just show you that we were talking about, so these are the two pathways that would be activated. Now here is particularly talking about psychosocial stress, right? So again, if you kind of think about, you can get both this increase in cortisol, right, which would lead to all of these effects here. Again, you can see this sort of decrease in immune activity due to this release of cortisol, and also other effects as well. And then also, this is the increase in sympathetic activity is that fight or flight, right? And so we're going to just talk a little bit more specifically about these two pathways as we move on. The other thing here I just wanted to mention, this is showing you, because again, it may have sort of been confusing, kind of this, I keep saying this decrease in immune activity, where here is kind of showing you this increase in immune activity, right? But again, this is specifically showing you sort of in response to infection, injury, or inflammation, you will have this happening too. You may have the other sort of pathways activated as well, depending on kind of what else is going on. But this pathway here and the increase of these pro-inflammatory cytokines in the brain will, again, sort of activate immune activity, but then because of where they're located in the brain and what sorts of brain regions will be activated by these inflammatory cytokines, you also then will see this sickness behavior and all of these things that are sort of a result of this activation. Okay, so this is kind of something separate, again, something that you're going to see that's going to be activated in times of infection, injury, inflammation. Essentially will activate this pathway as well. And again, this technically kind of is this increase in immune activity. But again, remember it's sort of separate from the other two sort of stress pathways, the HPA axis, which we're going to talk about more, and the release of norepinephrine and epinephrine. Okay, so again, the activation of the HPA axis is really primarily responsible for this sort of decrease in immune activity. And again, for your purposes clinically in patients that you're going to see, most of what you're going to encounter is sort of this chronic stress or chronic stress effects on health, and mostly it's due to this sort of decrease in immune activity that then leads them to get sick, and all these other effects of the two pathways that we're going to talk about. Okay, now I'm just going to skip through some of these next few slides because we already covered them in class. I just wanted to come back to here just to clarify that if that was confusing, these two figures, okay? All right, so like I said, we did this already, so I'm skipping through. We talked about homeostasis, and then we talked about allostasis, and those terms really are related. Remember, allostasis is this sort of idea that instead of it's this defined set point, it's more of a range in terms of where the body is trying to get back to, because there's always this sort of flux that's going on. Like I said, let me kind of skip through these because we've already talked about them, okay? We also mentioned this general adaptation syndrome, this model that was developed by Hans Seeley. And again, these are things that we probably were talking about throughout the class. So again, sorry if these slides seem redundant. I'm trying to work through this textbook just like you guys are, and so I realize that some of the stuff is a little redundant. So if it seems that way, that is the truth, okay? So let me again kind of go through this because we did this already. Okay, and I think we kind of ended right here, and we're going to be this is where we're going to essentially where we left off, okay? So again, these are things, this figure really sums up things that we already talked about throughout the class period, okay? So again, if it seems redundant, it is, but I guess it's sort of summarizing what we talked about, okay? All right, so now let's talk a little bit more specifically about what's happening when you're encountering stress in terms of those two pathways that are activated. Okay, so again, the primary mechanisms, HPA axis activated and also sympathetic adrenal medullary system, right? Which essentially is going to be, stress will be perceived or sort of taken in by a couple different brain regions. Ultimately, once that information is processed, it'll get sent to the hypothalamus, right, to activate this pathway here, or sort of or to the, not or, more like and, right, to the locus coeruleus, which is abbreviated LC, norepinephrine system. Okay, so again, this is kind of what's going to activate that or increase that sympathetic activity. That's the sort of fight or flight pathway that we think about. Okay, so again, if we focus in on the HPA axis, it's going to affect hormone secretion, particularly cortisol from the adrenal glands. Okay, so hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal axis. Okay, and again, I think we might have started this in class, so I'm just kind of reviewing, which is fine. I mentioned the LC, or locus coeruleus norepinephrine system. Okay, these neurons are located in the pons, right, in the brainstem, and they have multiple connections. So they connect to the limbic system, which is the amygdala and the hippocampus, right, involved in sort of emotional memory and fear, also to the hypothalamus, which again is going to activate HPA, but also has the ability of triggering the release of other hormones in the body as well. Thalamus is kind of relay station. Spinal cord, same thing, is going to send, information elsewhere. Okay, so regulates norepinephrine release, controls alertness, arousal, vigilance. Again, this is the fight or flight. This is going to get you ready to do something. And sometimes maybe you're going to be too alert, right? And so this may affect CNS coordination during stress. Again, it has, once this is activated, yes, it's going to lead to norepinephrine and epinephrine release, but also has multiple connections, right? And so will also sort of activate and sort of coordinate with even with the HPA axis activation. Okay, so we're talking about this, same thing again. If you talk about adaptive stress response, right? HPA. So again, think of more immediate, the fight or flight, as being the locus coeruleus norepinephrine system being activated. Then HPA kind of comes into play because cortisol is going to try to get everything to come back to homeostasis. Okay. All right. So again, some brain structures that are involved, and I think there's a picture next that kind of shows some of these. And these aren't all the brain structures that are involved, but these are the sort of the main players here. Again, amygdala, particularly important in fear, mediation of fear, hippocampus, emotional memory, but has to do with fear too, right? Fearful memories. You need the hippocampus to sort of remember those events. Prefrontal cortex involved in this decision making, right? Personality. So again, this is involved in sort of how you cope, right? And what you're going to do when facing that stress. Hypothalamus, again, the main regulator of the endocrine system, right, and the release of hormones. So, like I said, there's a picture that shows these areas, and again, you probably had a little neuroanatomy and have heard of these before, okay? And so we just mentioned pretty much all of these as well. Okay, so again, these are all involved in the interpretation of stress. Once that stress is interpreted and processed, the information then gets sent off to basically activate the pathways that we're talking about next. Okay, and so here it is, right? So again, here's your stimuli, goes into the central nervous system, particularly those brain regions we just mentioned, right? Gets processed in some way, and then both of these pathways will be activated, okay? So again, locus coeruleus norepinephrine, adrenal medulla, right? So this is the center of the adrenal gland, which will release norepinephrine and epinephrine. And then this is where you're going to get this increase in sympathetic activity in target organs, right? Increase blood flow to the muscles, increase in heart rate, things like that. If you talk about the HPA axis, right, again, it's going to start off in the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus will release something called corticotropin releasing hormone. Sometimes you see it listed as CRF, releasing factor. That then will go to the pituitary gland, stimulate the pituitary gland to release ACTH, okay, which is adrenocorticotropic hormone, okay, and then this will enter the bloodstream and eventually go to the adrenal gland, to the adrenal cortex to release cortisol. And then cortisol will have its effects on the target organs, right? And remember, there was a couple slides ago how to figure that kind of showed the effects of cortisol on the body. This then will basically, there's negative feedback mechanisms that will feed back up here to the brain to basically turn off its production once there is enough around. Okay, and so those are the two pathways there. Now, with the next, so again, this is sort of the technical science part of it, right? To know these two pathways. What are the two main pathways that are activated by stress? It is this you can, even if you kind of said fight or flight, or you said sympathetic pathway, look at sort of this norepinephrine pathway, however you want to say it, but the release of norepinephrine and epinephrine from the adrenal medulla is one pathway that's going to increase sympathetic activity, and then also the activation of the HPA axis. Okay, so these are the two main pathways that are activated by stress. Okay, so now if we talk about some clinical manifestations of stress throughout the body, again, I feel like we probably know these, right? This part, the technical science part, is something that probably maybe we don't know, and that might require a little more studying, right? But this stuff and a lot of the stuff we talked about with the coping and things like that, we probably already know because we all experience stress, right? The thing is that this really does affect the whole body, right? So you're going to have multi-system effects of stress, okay? And depending on the person, it's going to manifest itself in different ways, okay? One of the other things is that it can lead to these unhealthy lifestyle choices, and we talked about this, right? Some unhealthy ways of coping, okay? In terms of, you want to kind of look at some of these different systems, what are some potential manifestations of stress? Again, we've probably experienced some of these, right? So hair, it's showing you hair loss, increased release of certain hormones, right? Eventually, I mean, this is kind of, there's other effects in the brain too. This is really sort of a short list, but that then can lead to, feeling bad about yourself or being tired or things like that, right? So again, mouth, heart, lungs, muscles, these are, again, just a short list, really, of some examples. There are many, many, many ways that stress can manifest itself, and it will vary between patients. Okay, and so again, this is now showing you sort of some disorders and conditions that will essentially can be caused or like it says here, can be sort of aggravated by stress. And obviously there's a typo there. I'll fix that if I remember to fix it, but just know that that's not spelled right. And again, you can see here, right? Nervous system, anxiety, depression, headaches, right? Immunity, cancer, decreased immune response, hay fever. So, I mean, again, cancer is related to the immune system. Your immune system is supposed to be able to get rid of those cancer cells. And if you have a decrease in immune activity, you're not able to do that. That's when you can see cancers develop, and obviously other types of infections as well. Okay, so you guys can take a look at this figure. I mean, I think this figure is pretty nice because it just gives you examples. But again, it's pretty much a very wide variety of disorders and conditions that can be caused or exacerbated or aggravated by stress. Okay, so this is particularly talking about now psychiatric disorders, right? Depression, anxiety, PTSD. These are the ones, when we think of stress, they're probably the disorders that we think of most, okay? And again, we've kind of been talking about some of these things as we move through. So it says potential emotional responses, right, to a perceived threat, right? Intense fear, helplessness, horror, right? And so whether you experience something like that in the past or not, it doesn't really matter, right? So whenever thinking about this perceived threat, you experience these things, it's going to lead to potentially to, sort of chronic feelings like this that then can lead to anxiety and depression. So again, we talked about all this, right? When you talk about, a traumatic event or something like that, or right, which is stress technically, the way somebody perceives it is very different, right? And also the way that you cope with it is very different amongst individuals, okay? And it's a sort of lack of proper coping or what have you that's going to then lead to problems later on. Okay, so again, most commonly occurring disorders, depression and anxiety that again are triggered by stress. So if we talk about anxiety, and you talk about obviously experiencing a traumatic event. All right, sorry, little detour there. Talk about a traumatic event. Again, it's any external stressor that's going to produce anxiety. The threat basically is perceived as overwhelming. The individual is unable to cope, right? So this is, again, explaining how anxiety essentially develops. Therefore, you have sympathetic activation and will cause certain signs and symptoms of anxiety. And the same thing, as I said about stress in general, but anxiety manifests itself very different amongst individuals, right? So those sort of sympathetic things like increased heart rate, right? You might have heart palpitations. That could be a sign of anxiety. There's other things, hair loss, some of the things that we kind of talked about already with stress, then will sort of be these signs of anxiety. There always has been a connection between anxiety and depression, right? So kind of a lot of times the two will coincide. Not always, okay? It says depression may influence event perceptions. Depression may present due to failed coping. Again, there's this sort of connection because at some point, so you have this fear, right? You have these sort of anxiety symptoms, and at some point you kind of then feel helpless and really aren't able, feel like you can't cope anymore, and that's where it leads to sort of the depression and the sort of sense that you can't do anything anymore about it. And so that's why the two really do coincide together. Okay, so this is showing you psychiatric disorders characterized by re-experience of a traumatic situation, okay? So PTSD, acute stress disorder, and these are some of the defining criteria. And I will tell you, this has changed recently, so I'm not really sure. Yeah, I think it's more recent. But anyway, some of these sort of defining criteria in terms of what's used clinically to define PTSD versus anxiety and things like that. Some of those criteria have changed. If you look at the, but for our experiences or our purposes, this is fine, and I think this is actually to date here. Right, persistent re-experiencing of the traumatic event through flashbacks, persistent attempts to avoid stimuli perceived to be associated with the traumatic event. So this is something called like avoidance, right? So again, you can kind of see how this sort of gets you and starts or gets you to a place where it's going to interfere with everyday life, right? If you're constantly trying to avoid anything that might remind you of that traumatic event, maybe now you're not going to school because you're scared that you're going to, find something like that. And so again, you can see how this then leads to depression, right? Because of these things. Okay, so this is just showing you, so symptom onset for acute stress disorder about 1 month after, and then they don't really last much longer. PTSD, these develop longer after the actual traumatic event, and they actually last a lot longer. Maybe it can last a lifetime. Okay, if you talk about so this is talking about memory, and I think I mentioned this before, right? The hippocampus is closely associated with the amygdala, but particularly involved in memory, okay? So again, you're going to remember that traumatic event, or memory of that traumatic event involves the hippocampus, okay? So it says can't distinguish threat level of similar cues, right? So this is kind of what I was mentioning kind of with the avoidance thing and with the PTSD. If anything, so say you were a military personnel that was out in the field and you experienced a bomb, right? And that loud noise may then trigger these sort of memories later on, right? So anything that's loud, it may not really sound like that, what you heard when you were out in the field, but anything that's loud is going to remind you of that, right? So you sort of have this failure to really, really associate the proper cue with that bad memory, okay? And so this is kind of what starts to happen. And again, it has to do with the hippocampus because that's the memory part of it. Okay, so we kind of talked about this already. Again, every time you're going to re-experience that trauma, you then will have the stress response triggered again, right? So you're going to keep having this increase in sympathetic activity and this increase in cortisol, which is going to obviously lead to problems because it's this sort of chronic activation. Okay. So now these are some other disorders. So, right, so those were psychiatric disorders, PTSD, anxiety, depression. Here now we're talking, I guess, more about, right, physiologic disorders, okay, and gives you some examples here. Again, we talked about this, right? Many body systems are susceptible to stress-related diseases, respiratory, neurologic, gastrointestinal, cardiovascular, immune, pretty much every system, okay? If we talk about MS, and so I guess these are examples of particular diseases that you see are exacerbated or aggravated by stress, okay? So multiple sclerosis, says here, this is sort of just an anecdotal report by individuals that, right, that when their life is stressful, right, they see that their MS symptoms start to get worse, right? So in MS in general, you see this sort of, patients have periods of relapse and remittance, right? And so there's times where they may not show many symptoms, but then times when the symptoms really start to increase in severity. And so this has been connected to times of stress. And there have been studies that have shown that the sort of development of MS involves inappropriate stress response. So that there's dysregulation of cytokine production, you get this sort of impaired inflammatory response, which then may lead to this sort of this autoimmune disease, right? I mean, MS is autoimmune. Your body is attacking or killing the cells that make myelin. And if you have a decrease in myelin around the axons of your neurons, they're not going to be able to transmit nerve impulses as efficiently. And so it leads to problems with vision, right? And motor problems as well. If you talk about gastrointestinal disease, right? Increased sympathetic response, right? So again, that can then promote inflammatory bowel disease. Okay, so increased motor activity of the colon, blunted HPA response because of these sort of inflammatory mediators that are there. And so then therefore, if you have a blunted HPA response, your body's not able to come back to homeostasis, right? Also other changes in structures that can then lead to hypersecretion of gastric acid and things like that that can lead to gastrointestinal disease. So anyway, you can see that none of these are clear-cut, right? There's a lot of interplay between all of these sort of systems that we talked about that are activated, right? There's a lot of interplay and sort of cross-talk between the brain regions that are activated. So the one thing to understand is that none of this is really clear-cut, right? Really, stress has the ability to affect any system and really can lead to any symptom, depending on the individual. Cardiovascular disease, okay? Again, stress has been shown, right, to be linked to heart attacks. I'm sure we've heard of that before, okay? Same thing, it says increases levels of hostility, anxiety. This is more kind of, I guess, on the chronic level that you can get development of coronary artery disease, okay? So big connection there. Again, is there one direct sort of link in terms of what aspect of stress is causing this? No, it has to do with all the things that we talked about all coming together to, increase the susceptibility to these types of diseases. So it's just saying here, personality characterized by increased negative affect, right, is linked to poor cardiovascular outcomes. I would imagine this is probably true to every disease, that you're going to have a poorer outcome. if you have this sort of negative personality, right, and have, you know, experience chronic stress and aren't able to cope, again, it's going to be harder for you to basically recover from probably any disorder, okay? Again, if we talk about chronic stress, what are you going to have? You're going to have an increase in sympathetic activity, an increase in HPA activity, which then can lead to chronic inflammation. We've kind of been talking about this before, right? If you talk about MS, autoimmune, right? You have extra inflammation. That's then causing that, essentially causing that disease or aggravating that disease. It's the same thing here, okay? Right? So if you have more inflammation, it basically, I mean, basically when you have, you know, clots in your blood vessels, right? Things get trapped there, but then, you know, then you also start to get inflammation in that area, and that's really what then is going to occlude those blood vessels. All right. So that's it. So again, you can kind of see, you know, let me just kind of end by this sort of immune activity and what's happening with stress. Again, kind of, it's not straightforward, right? We say that release of cortisol has immune suppressing, you know, sort of activity and will suppress the immune system. But we're also now, you know, talking about an increase in inflammation, you know, following chronic stress that then leads to autoimmune disorders like MS, that can lead to development of atherosclerosis, right, or essentially clogged arteries. So just remember that none of this is straightforward. So if it seems like it's confusing, it's because there is so much, like I said, interplay between all of these sort of different factors that we talked about throughout the lecture. Okay, so remember, if you have questions, you can ask me, okay? Please come and ask me if something needs clarification. We will review all of chapters 1 through 4 on Monday, you know, on Monday in class, and also we'll go over the case study.